Family loyalty is something most people grow up believing is very important. From a young age, we are often taught that family comes first, no matter what. We are told to stand by our parents, siblings, and relatives in every situation, whether good or bad. This belief becomes a strong part of how we see the world. We feel that supporting our family is not just a choice, but a duty. It gives us a sense of belonging, identity, and emotional security. However, there are moments in life when this idea is tested in ways we never expected. Sometimes, being loyal to family can come into conflict with our personal values, beliefs, and sense of right and wrong. This is where the real struggle begins, and it can be one of the most painful emotional situations a person can face. In this story, the conflict begins when a sister makes a strong and emotional demand. She wants her sibling to become the godparent of her child, a child that was born as a result of an affair. For her, this may feel like a natural request. She may believe that family should support her no matter what choices she has made. She might feel that her sibling's role is to stand beside her, protect her, and accept her child without question. In her mind, refusing this request could feel like betrayal, rejection, or even judgment. She might already be feeling guilt, shame, or fear because of the circumstances surrounding the child's birth. And she may be looking for reassurance and unconditional acceptance from her family. On the other side, the protagonist is facing a completely different emotional reality. They are not just being asked to take on a symbolic role. They are being asked to make a decision that goes against their personal values. Becoming a godparent is often seen as a meaningful and serious responsibility. It can carry spiritual, moral, and emotional significance. For some, it means agreeing to guide the child in life, to be a role model, and to stand as a support system in times of need. It is not a role that should be taken lightly, and it is not something everyone feels comfortable accepting, especially when the situation around the child's birth is complicated. The protagonist may feel deeply uncomfortable with the idea of supporting something they do not agree with. The affair itself might conflict with their beliefs about trust, honesty, and commitment in relationships. They may feel that by accepting the role of godparent, they are indirectly approving or ignoring the actions that led to the child's birth. This creates a strong internal conflict. On one hand, they love their sister and do not want to hurt her. On the other hand, they feel that saying yes would mean betraying their own principles. This kind of situation can lead to a heavy emotional burden. The protagonist may feel trapped, as if there is no right answer. Saying yes may bring temporary peace with their sister, but it could lead to long-term feelings of guilt, discomfort, or even resentment. They might feel that they have lost a part of themselves by going against their values. On the other hand, saying no could protect their personal boundaries and allow them to stay true to what they believe in. However, it could also lead to serious consequences in their relationship with their sister and possibly the wider family. Family pressure can make this decision even more difficult. Other relatives might get involved, offering opinions, advice, or even criticism. Some may argue that family should always come first, and that the protagonist should put aside their personal feelings for the sake of unity. They might say things like, "It's your sister, you have to support her," or "The child is innocent, don't punish the child for the mother's actions." These arguments can be powerful and emotionally charged, making the protagonist feel guilty for even considering saying no. At the same time, there may be a lack of understanding for the protagonist's perspective. People may not fully appreciate how deeply personal values can affect decisions like this. For the protagonist, this is not just about a simple favor. It is about integrity, self-respect, and staying true to their beliefs. When others dismiss these feelings, it can make the situation even more isolating and painful. Setting personal boundaries in such situations is extremely challenging. Boundaries are important because they protect our emotional well-being and help us maintain a sense of self. They allow us to define what we are comfortable with and what we are not. However, when it comes to family, boundaries can feel like walls that push loved ones away. The fear of damaging relationships can make it hard to stand firm. The protagonist may struggle with questions like, am I being too harsh? Should I just agree to keep the peace? Is my relationship with my sister more important than my beliefs? These questions can lead to sleepless nights, anxiety, and emotional stress. It is not just a simple decision. It is a deeply personal and emotional journey. Another important aspect of this situation is the idea of unconditional support. Many people believe that family love should be unconditional, meaning that it should not depend on circumstances or choices. While this idea is beautiful in theory, it can become complicated in real life. Supporting someone does not always mean agreeing with everything they do. It is possible to love someone while still disagreeing with their actions. The challenge is finding a balance between compassion and honesty. The protagonist might still care deeply for their sister and her child, even if they choose not to become the godparent. They may want to be involved in the child's life in other ways, offering love and support without taking on a role that feels uncomfortable. However, the sister may not see it this way. She may view the refusal as a rejection not just of the role, but of her and her child as well. This misunderstanding can lead to conflict, arguments, and emotional distance. The sister might feel hurt, angry, or betrayed. She might say things that are driven by emotion, such as threatening to cut off contact or accusing the protagonist of being judgmental. These reactions can make the situation even more painful and difficult to handle. In moments like this, communication becomes very important. The way the protagonist expresses their feelings can make a big difference. If they explain their decision with honesty, kindness, and respect, it may help reduce some of the tension. They can make it clear that their decision is not about rejecting their sister or her child, but about staying true to their own beliefs. However, even with the best communication, there is no guarantee that the other person will understand or accept the decision. This situation also highlights the importance of self-awareness. The protagonist needs to reflect on their own values and priorities. They need to ask themselves what matters most to them and what they are willing to compromise on. This kind of self-reflection can be difficult, but it is necessary for making a decision that they can live with in the long term. It is also important to recognize that there are no perfect solutions in situations like this. Every choice comes with consequences. The goal is not to find a perfect answer, but to make a decision that aligns with one's values and allows for personal peace. Sometimes, this means accepting that not everyone will be happy with the decision. Over time, relationships can change and heal. Even if there is conflict in the beginning, there is always a possibility for understanding and reconciliation in the future. People grow, perspectives change, and emotions settle. What feels like a permanent break in a relationship may not always stay that way. In the end, this story is a powerful example of how complex family relationships can be. It shows that love and loyalty are not always simple or straightforward. It also highlights the importance of personal boundaries and staying true to oneself. While family is important, it is also important to respect one's own values and beliefs. The protagonist's journey is not just about saying yes or no to a request. It is about understanding themselves, facing difficult emotions, and making a choice that reflects who they are. It is a reminder that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that test our sense of identity and integrity. This keynote teaches us that family pressure can sometimes go beyond healthy limits. It can force individuals into situations where they feel they must choose between their loved ones and their own sense of right and wrong. In such moments, it is important to remember that setting boundaries is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of self-respect and emotional honesty. At the same time, it also reminds us to approach others with empathy and understanding. The sister in the story is also dealing with her own struggles, fears, and emotions. While her approach may be forceful. It may come from a place of vulnerability and a need for support. Ultimately, this story does not offer a simple answer, but it encourages thoughtful reflection. It asks us to consider how we would respond in a similar situation, and what values we would choose to prioritize. It shows that life is full of complex, emotional challenges, and sometimes, the most important thing is to stay true to ourselves while still trying to treat others with kindness and respect. The idea of moral responsibility can feel very heavy, especially when it is connected to a role that carries deep meaning, like becoming a godmother. For many people, this role is not just a simple title or a small favor. It represents trust, guidance, and a long-term commitment to a child's life. A godmother is often expected to be a role model, someone who offers emotional support, teaches values, and sometimes even steps in during difficult times. Because of this, accepting such a role is not always an easy decision. It requires careful thought, honesty, and a clear understanding of one's own beliefs and boundaries. In this situation, the protagonist is faced with a difficult, emotional, and moral challenge. On one side, there is an innocent child who has done nothing wrong and deserves love, care, and support, like any other child. On the other side, there are the circumstances of the child's birth, which involve an affair. This creates a deep internal conflict for the protagonist. They are not just deciding whether to support a child, they are also thinking about what it means to be connected to a situation that goes against their moral values. This is where the burden of moral responsibility becomes very clear. The protagonist is not being asked to make a neutral or simple choice. Instead, they are being asked to take on a role that could feel like an endorsement of something they do not agree with. Even if no one says it directly, the act of becoming a godmother might feel, to them, like they are accepting or overlooking the actions that led to the child's birth. This can create a sense of discomfort, guilt, or even inattention. At the same time, the protagonist likely feels compassion for the child. It is natural to feel sympathy for a baby who had no control over how they came into the world. The child is innocent and should not be blamed for the choices of the adults involved. This makes the situation even more emotionally complicated. The protagonist may feel torn between their desire to protect and care for the child and their need to stay true to their own moral beliefs. This leads to an important question that many people struggle with in different forms. Can you separate the child from the choices of the parents? In theory, the answer seems simple. Most people would agree that a child should not be judged or treated differently because of the actions of their parents. Children deserve love, fairness, and opportunities regardless of their background. However, in real-life situations, this separation is not always easy. Emotions, beliefs, and personal values can make it difficult to fully separate the two. For the protagonist, becoming a godmother might feel like more than just supporting the child. It might feel like becoming part of a story that they are not comfortable with. Even if their intention is to focus only on the child, the connection to the larger situation remains. This is what creates the inner struggle. The burden of moral responsibility also includes thinking about the future. The protagonist might wonder what their role will look like over time. Will they be expected to attend family events where the affair is openly accepted or ignored? Will they have to explain their role to others who may question it? Will they feel comfortable answering questions from the child in the future about their family situation? These thoughts can add to the pressure and make the decision feel even more serious. Another layer of this burden is the fear of being misunderstood. If the protagonist refuses the role, others may see them as cold, judgmental, or unsupportive. They may be accused of punishing the child for something that is not their fault. This can be very painful, especially if the protagonist knows that their intentions are not negative. They may genuinely care about the child but still feel unable to accept the responsibility of being a godmother. On the other hand, if they accept the role, they may feel like they are betraying their own values. This can lead to a different kind of emotional pain, one that comes from within. They might feel uneasy, conflicted, or even resentful over time. This shows how the burden of moral responsibility is not just about how others see us, but also about how we see ourselves. It is also important to understand that moral values are deeply personal. What feels right for one person may not feel right for another. Some people may be able to separate the child from the parent's actions without difficulty. They may see becoming a godmother as an act of love and support that has nothing to do with the past. Others may find this separation much harder, especially if their values strongly emphasize accountability, honesty, or certain beliefs about relationships. Neither perspective is necessarily wrong, but they can lead to very different choices. This is why the protagonist's struggle is so real and important. It is not about choosing between right and wrong in a simple way. It is about navigating a situation where both options carry emotional weight and consequences. Compassion plays a key role in this situation. The protagonist may feel a strong sense of empathy for both the child and the sister. The sister may be going through a difficult time, dealing with judgment from others, and trying to find support within the family. Her request for the protagonist to become a godmother may come from a place of need, vulnerability, or even fear of being alone. At the same time, compassion does not mean ignoring one's own feelings or boundaries. It is possible to care about others while still recognizing what feels right or wrong for oneself. This balance can be hard to achieve, especially when emotions are high and relationships are at risk. The idea of responsibility also brings up questions about commitment. Becoming a godmother is not just about a single moment or ceremony. It is a long-term role that can influence a child's life in meaningful ways. The protagonist may feel that if they cannot fully embrace the role with honesty and sincerity, it would not be fair to the child. This sense of integrity can make the decision even more difficult, as they want to do what is truly right, not just what is expected. Another important aspect of this situation is the pressure to make a decision quickly. Family members may expect an immediate answer, especially if there are plans for a ceremony or event. This can make the protagonist feel rushed and overwhelmed. However, decisions involving moral responsibility often require time, reflection, and careful thought. Rushing can lead to choices that are later regretted. Over time, the protagonist may go through different stages of thinking. At first, they may feel shocked or confused by the request. Then, they may start to analyze their feelings, consider different perspectives, and imagine possible outcomes. They may talk to trusted friends or reflect on their own experiences and beliefs. This process can be emotionally exhausting, but it is also necessary for making a thoughtful decision. The burden of moral responsibility is not something that can be easily shared or transferred. Ultimately, the decision rests with the individual. Others may offer advice or opinions, but they do not carry the same emotional and moral weight. This can make the protagonist feel alone in their decision, even when surrounded by family. Despite the difficulty, this kind of situation can also lead to personal growth. It forces the protagonist to think deeply about their values, their priorities, and the kind of person they want to be. It challenges them to find a balance between compassion and integrity, between love for others and respect for themselves. In the end, the question of whether you can separate the child from the choices of the parents does not have a simple or universal answer. It depends on individual beliefs, emotions, and circumstances. What matters most is that the decision is made with honesty, thoughtfulness, and a clear understanding of its impact. This keynote highlights how complex moral responsibility can be, especially when it is connected to family and emotions. It shows that even acts of love and support can come with difficult questions and internal struggles. It reminds us that being a good person is not always about saying yes or no, but about understanding why we make the choices we do. The protagonist's journey is not just about accepting or refusing a role. It is about facing a deeply personal challenge, one that tests their values, their compassion, and their sense of responsibility. It is about learning that sometimes doing what feels right is not easy, but it is necessary for living with honesty and self-respect. At the same time, the story encourages empathy for everyone involved. The child deserves love and care. The sister may be seeking acceptance and support, and the protagonist is trying to navigate a complex emotional situation with integrity. Recognizing all these perspectives can help create a more balanced and understanding approach, even if the final decision is difficult. In the end, the burden of moral responsibility is not something to fear, but something to approach with care and awareness. It is a reminder that our choices matter, not just to others, but to ourselves. And while the path may be challenging, it is also an opportunity to grow, reflect, and stay true to what we believe in. Emotional manipulation is a subtle yet powerful form of control that can happen in any kind of relationship, but it becomes especially complicated and painful when it occurs within families. Families are supposed to be spaces of love, trust, and support, where members can express themselves honestly without fear of punishment or rejection. However, in some situations, family relationships can turn toxic, and emotional manipulation becomes a way for one person to get what they want, by controlling or pressuring others. In this story, the sister uses a very clear and harsh ultimatum. The protagonist must accept the role of godmother, or they will be disowned. This is not a simple request or a conversation, it is a threat disguised as a demand, and it immediately changes the nature of the relationship. Instead of being based on understanding, respect, or love, the interaction becomes a struggle over power and compliance. The use of an ultimatum is a classic example of emotional manipulation because it replaces dialogue with coercion. Rather than explaining her feelings, fears, or needs and allowing the protagonist to make an informed choice, the sister resorts to fear specifically, the fear of being cut off from the family. This creates an incredibly stressful situation for the protagonist. Fear of disownment touches on one of the deepest human needs, belonging. Humans are naturally wired to seek acceptance and connection with their family, and threats of exclusion strike at the very heart of emotional security. When a loved one presents a choice that feels like a life or death situation for the relationship, it forces the other person into a corner. The protagonist is now placed in an emotionally coerced position where every possible response feels like it carries heavy consequences. This kind of manipulation works by creating guilt and obligation. The sister's message is essentially, if you truly loved me, you would agree. This reframes the protagonist's decision not as a personal choice, but as a moral failing. If they say no, guilt is a powerful tool because it makes people feel responsible for others' emotions, even when those feelings are unfairly imposed. The protagonist may feel that saying no will hurt their sister, shame their family, or even betray their own identity. The weight of these emotions can be crushing, because they are not just abstract feelings, they are tied to real fears of losing connection, love, and support. One of the key points here is that manipulation often makes love feel conditional. True family love, ideally, should be unconditional. It should not depend on agreement, compliance, or approval. However, when ultimatums are used, love is presented as something that must be earned or maintained through obedience. The sister's approach transforms the relationship from one of mutual respect and understanding into one of control. Instead of engaging in dialogue, listening to perspectives, and finding a compromise, the interaction becomes transactional, comply, or face punishment. This can create long-term emotional scars. The protagonist may begin to associate family relationships with fear, pressure, and obligation rather than warmth, safety, and support. Over time, this can erode self-esteem, create resentment, and even cause lasting anxiety around family interactions. Another important aspect is the erosion of autonomy. When someone issues an emotional ultimatum, They are essentially trying to take away another person's ability to choose freely. The protagonist's right to make a decision based on their values, beliefs, and comfort level is overridden by a threat. This can feel deeply invalidating, as if their feelings, principles, and boundaries do not matter. It also forces them to weigh their own morals against the desire to maintain family connection. This inner conflict can be exhausting and emotionally destabilizing. The story also highlights the difference between healthy persuasion and manipulation. In a healthy family dynamic, discussions involve sharing thoughts and feelings, negotiating, and seeking to understand each other. Even if there is disagreement, both sides are respected, and the final decision is made with mutual consent. Emotional manipulation, by contrast, bypasses understanding and instead tries to achieve compliance through fear, guilt, or coercion. By presenting an ultimatum, the sister essentially removes the possibility of respectful negotiation. There is no room for compromise or conversation, only a forced choice. This tactic also plays on the human tendency to avoid conflict and rejection. Most people naturally want to preserve relationships and maintain peace. By threatening disownment, the sister is exploiting this instinct. Knowing that the fear of losing family ties will push the protagonist toward agreement, even if it violates their own values. The emotional pressure becomes a form of control, where compliance is extracted not through reason or mutual understanding, but through fear of loss. The consequences of this dynamic extend beyond the immediate decision. It can shape the protagonist's perception of family, trust, and relationships. They may begin to question whether love in their family is genuine or conditional. They may wonder if other interactions are also motivated by manipulation rather than care. This can lead to a cycle of anxiety, hypervigilance, and even emotional withdrawal, where the protagonist starts to protect themselves by limiting openness and vulnerability. Additionally, ultimatums like this can create a false sense of moral responsibility. The protagonist may feel that they are morally at fault for refusing, even though the situation is constructed in a way that makes them responsible for another person's emotional reactions. This is a common tactic in manipulation, shifting the blame onto the person who is being pressured. It is important to recognize that the feelings of guilt or fear being induced are not necessarily reflective of wrongdoing. The sister's threats are designed to make the protagonist feel morally compromised, even when they are not. Furthermore, manipulation through emotional ultimatums often obscures the complexity of the situation. The sister is presenting a binary choice: accept or lose connection, when in reality, there are many nuanced possibilities. The protagonist could potentially engage with the child in a way that feels authentic without fully taking on the role of godmother. They could offer support in other forms, maintain communication with the sister, or set boundaries that protect their own values. By framing the decision as an all-or-nothing scenario, the manipulator limits the other person's perceived options and exerts maximum pressure. Another important theme here is the psychological impact of threats in relationships. Repeated exposure to ultimatums and emotional coercion can lead to chronic stress, feelings of helplessness, and difficulty making decisions in other areas of life. It can also impair emotional clarity, as the fear and guilt generated by the manipulator can cloud judgment and make it harder for the person to trust their instincts. The story shows that manipulation is not always obvious. The sister may claim that her threat is motivated by love or concern, framing her actions as justified. This is a common technique called gaslighting, where the manipulator tries to make the other person doubt their perception of the situation. The protagonist may question themselves: am I overreacting? Or am I being unfair? This self-doubt is part of how manipulation maintains control. At its core, this keynote highlights the importance of recognizing toxic dynamics in families. Not every conflict is manipulation, but when fear, guilt, and threats are used to force compliance, the relationship crosses into unhealthy territory. It reminds us that love should not be conditional, and family bonds should not be maintained through coercion. Healthy relationships are based on respect, understanding, and choice, not fear and obligation. The protagonist's experience also underscores the need for personal boundaries. In order to protect emotional well-being, it is crucial to recognize when manipulation is occurring and to assert limits in a calm and firm way. Setting boundaries can be difficult, especially when the manipulator is a loved one, but it is essential for preserving autonomy, self-respect, and mental health. In conclusion, the story of the sister Essie ultimatum demonstrates how emotional manipulation can operate within families and how deeply it can affect the individual being targeted. It shows the difference between relationships built on respect and those built on fear, and it emphasizes the importance of maintaining personal boundaries even in the face of intense pressure. By examining this situation, we gain insight into the dynamics of coercion, guilt, and control, and we see the profound emotional challenge of navigating a family relationship where love is made conditional through threats rather than nurtured through dialogue and mutual respect. This keynote teaches that while family bonds are important, they should not come at the cost of one's autonomy, values, or emotional health. Recognizing manipulation, understanding its effects, and learning to respond with clear boundaries are essential skills for preserving both family relationships and personal integrity. In every story where there is conflict within a family, especially when moral and emotional dilemmas are involved, one of the most important and often overlooked perspectives is that of the child. In this particular situation, amid the tension between the protagonist and the sister, the child occupies a completely innocent position. The child has no control over the circumstances of their birth, nor do they have the ability to influence the decisions being made by the adults around them. Yet, the child is deeply affected by these choices, even if indirectly. This keynote emphasizes that children should not be blamed, punished, or held responsible for the actions of adults. They are individuals who deserve love, care, and acceptance, independent of the complexities and mistakes that may have surrounded their entry into the world. The protagonist, while struggling with their own moral values and the pressure from their sister, must also navigate their feelings toward this innocent child. The child represents purity, vulnerability, and a kind of unconditional openness that is often contrasted sharply with the adult world's complexity. While the sister may be asking for support in a way that pressures the protagonist emotionally, the child's presence complicates the decision because it introduces genuine empathy. The protagonist may feel a natural instinct to care for the child, to protect them, and to ensure that the child experiences love rather than rejection. This emotional pull makes the decision more complicated because it is no longer just about agreeing or refusing a role. It is about balancing moral values with compassion. Empathy for the child can manifest in many ways. The protagonist might consider how the child will perceive rejection, whether the child will feel unloved or unworthy, and how that could impact their emotional development. Children are sensitive to the reactions of adults around them, even when a child does not fully understand the reasons behind adults' decisions. They can internalize feelings of disapproval, tension, or distance. Therefore, the protagonist may find themselves thinking, "How can I say no without hurting the child?" This internal questioning highlights the emotional complexity of the situation and the responsibility that comes with interacting with a child, even when they are not the source of the conflict. At the same time, it is important to recognize that empathy for the child does not mean compromising one's own values. The protagonist can feel love and care for the child without necessarily accepting a role that conflicts with their principles. This distinction is subtle but essential. Loving the child is separate from endorsing the circumstances of their birth, and understanding this can help the protagonist navigate the emotional landscape more effectively. The innocence of the child. also serves as a mirror to the adult world. While adults are capable of complex reasoning, moral judgment, and strategic thinking, children are guided largely by their emotions, trust, and basic needs for security and love. Seeing the child in this light can evoke a profound sense of responsibility. The protagonist may realize that their decision will have real consequences for the child's emotional well-being. This awareness can create a deep sense of care and concern, even when the adult conflict seems overwhelming. Furthermore, focusing on the child's innocence can help the protagonist reframe the situation. Instead of seeing the decision purely as a moral dilemma about the sister's actions, it can be reframed as an opportunity to act with compassion. The child becomes a central figure whose needs and feelings deserve consideration, which can soften the harshness of the adult conflict, without negating the protagonist's values. The concept of innocence also reminds us that children are fundamentally deserving of protection. They should not bear the burden of guilt, shame, or judgment that belongs to adults. The protagonist may reflect on their own childhood experiences, realizing how crucial it is for children to feel safe, valued, and loved, even when adults around them make mistakes. This reflection can strengthen their resolve to act in the child's best interests, while still maintaining personal integrity. Emotional attachment can also play a significant role. It is possible that, over time, the protagonist may develop feelings of affection, care, and even love toward the child. These feelings complicate the decision further, because they introduce a positive emotional dimension that is independent of the conflict with the sister. The protagonist may feel that they cannot completely walk away from the child, even if they decide not to take on the formal role of godmother. This creates a delicate balancing act: how to show love and support without compromising deeply held beliefs or becoming enmeshed in the sister's emotional demands. Another important aspect is understanding the long-term impact of adult decisions on children. While the child may be innocent now, the way adults handle their conflicts can shape the child's perception of relationships, trust, and morality. If the protagonist chooses to act with fairness, kindness, and integrity, it can provide a positive model for the child. Conversely, if the child experiences rejection or manipulation, it may leave lasting emotional scars. This knowledge can weigh heavily on the protagonist's mind and heart, further highlighting the emotional complexity of the situation. It is also worth noting that children often act as bridges between conflicting adults. In this story, the child could be a reason for maintaining some level of connection and communication with the sister. Even if the protagonist cannot agree to all of her demands, focusing on the child's well-being can provide a constructive framework for decision-making, allowing the protagonist to engage in the relationship in a way that prioritizes care and protection rather than submission or resentment. The innocence of the child also introduces the theme of unconditional love. While adult relationships are often complicated by expectations, judgment, and moral considerations, the child's innocence calls for a form of love that is pure and accepting. This does not mean abandoning boundaries or compromising values, but it does mean that the child deserves compassion and support simply because they exist and because they are vulnerable. This understanding can guide the protagonist in finding a middle path, one that allows them to honor their moral convictions while still offering the child a sense of security, care, and emotional presence. In many ways, the child embodies the hope for a future that is free from the mistakes of the past. While the adults may be caught in conflict, guilt, and complex moral judgment, the child represents a blank slate, a life that deserves nurturing, guidance, and positive influence. The protagonist may feel motivated to act in ways that support the child's growth and well-being, creating a ripple effect of care and love that transcends the immediate family conflict. The keynote also highlights the idea that decisions about children often require separating them from adult issues. While the sister's actions and emotional manipulation are central to the story, the child is not responsible for any of it. Recognizing this allows the protagonist to approach the situation with clarity and empathy, understanding that their choices can impact the child's life in meaningful ways without forcing them to compromise their own ethical stance. Moreover, focusing on the innocence of the child can also foster emotional resilience in the protagonist. By keeping the child's needs and well-being at the center, the protagonist can navigate the emotional pressures from the sister with a clearer sense of purpose. This perspective shifts the focus from fear, guilt, or obligation to care, compassion, and thoughtful action. Ultimately, this keynote teaches a fundamental lesson about human relationships and ethics. Children are always deserving of love and care, independent of the mistakes or circumstances of the adults around them. They should never be used as tools, pawns, or leverage in adult conflicts. The protagonist's struggle, while deeply personal and morally complex, is also an opportunity to act with integrity, empathy, and wisdom. By acknowledging the child's innocence, they can make decisions that protect the child's emotional well-being, demonstrate care and affection, and maintain moral clarity. The story reminds us that children are not extensions of adult choices. They are individuals with their own rights to love, security, and acceptance. While adults navigate the complexities of morality, guilt, and family pressure, the child's innocence serves as a guiding light, encouraging decisions that prioritize compassion, empathy, and support. The protagonist's empathy for the child can therefore act as a moral compass, helping them navigate a difficult, emotional landscape while preserving both their values and the child's right to a safe and nurturing environment. In conclusion, this keynote emphasizes that amidst adult conflicts, the innocence of the child must always be recognized and protected. The child deserves care, love, and acceptance, regardless of how they came into the world. The protagonist's emotional connection to the child highlights the importance of empathy and thoughtful decision-making, showing that love for a child can coexist with adherence to personal principles. By centering the child's innocence, the story illustrates how compassion and moral responsibility can guide difficult decisions, ensuring that the most vulnerable, those who did nothing to create the conflict, are not harmed in the process. Standing firm in self-respect is one of the most difficult yet essential challenges a person can face, especially when it comes to family dynamics. Family relationships are often some of the closest and most emotionally charged in our lives. We are socialized from a young age to value family loyalty, to obey, to protect, and to prioritize the well-being of relatives, sometimes above our own. This can create an intense internal pressure when a situation arises where loyalty and personal values are in conflict. In the story at hand, the protagonist is confronted with such a situation. Their sister demands that they become the godmother of a child born from an affair and threatens disownment if they refuse. This scenario tests the protagonist in ways that go far beyond a simple decision. It challenges their sense of morality, their emotional resilience, and their capacity to maintain personal boundaries in the face of fear, guilt, and manipulation. To stand firm in self-respect means first understanding what self-respect really is. Self-respect is the recognition of one's own worth, values, and boundaries. It is the ability to act in alignment with one's principles, even when doing so is difficult, unpopular, or emotionally uncomfortable. It is about refusing to compromise the core of who you are for the sake of pleasing others, even those you love. In the protagonist's case, standing firm requires them to reflect deeply on their beliefs about morality, integrity, and responsibility. Accepting the godmother role might seem, on the surface, like an act of love or family duty. But if it goes against their conscience, agreeing would undermine their sense of self and create inner conflict. On the other hand, saying no while preserving self-respect carries the risk of familial backlash, guilt, and even estrangement. The tension between these outcomes is the crucible in which courage is tested. Courage in this context is not about physical bravery, but moral bravery. The willingness to uphold personal values despite fear of rejection, criticism, or emotional pain. The protagonist must weigh the temporary discomfort of possible conflict against the long-term consequences of violating their own principles. This is where the concept of emotional integrity comes into play. Emotional integrity means being honest with oneself and others about one's feelings, beliefs, and limits. It is about refusing to live in a way that contradicts your conscience, even when external pressures are immense. Upholding emotional integrity can be incredibly challenging in family conflicts, particularly when manipulation and ultimatums are involved. Emotional manipulation, guilt-tripping, and threats are all designed to erode self-respect and make the individual doubt the validity of their own feelings. The sister's threat of disownment is a form of coercion, intended to force compliance by playing on deep fears of loss, abandonment, and shame. The protagonist, in response, must recognize that yielding to such pressure would not be an act of love, but a surrender of their autonomy. It is in this recognition that self-respect finds its foundation. The understanding that one's values and dignity are not negotiable, even in the face of intense external pressure. Standing firm also involves setting and maintaining personal boundaries. Boundaries are the invisible lines that define what we are willing to accept and what we are not. They protect our emotional well-being and define the limits of our engagement with others. In this situation, the protagonist's boundary might be that they are unwilling to accept a role that conflicts with their moral convictions. Asserting this boundary is not easy. It may provoke anger, disappointment, or rejection from the sister and possibly other family members. Yet, maintaining boundaries is critical for long-term emotional health. Without boundaries, one risks being drawn into situations that generate resentment, guilt, and emotional exhaustion. Another crucial aspect of standing firm is understanding that prioritizing oneself is not inherently selfish. Society often teaches that choosing oneself over others is selfish or wrong, especially when it comes to family. However, true self-respect requires recognizing that one's emotional well-being, values, and dignity are essential. Sacrificing them to appease others may seem noble at first, but in the long term, it can erode mental health, self-esteem, and personal identity. By standing firm, the protagonist demonstrates that choosing oneself is an act of courage and responsibility, not selfishness. The process of standing firm is rarely instantaneous. It involves reflection, emotional processing, and sometimes consultation with trusted friends or mentors. The protagonist must examine why the request makes them uncomfortable, what values are at stake, and what the consequences of both acceptance and refusal might be. This reflective process is critical because it ensures that the decision is deliberate, conscious, and aligned with personal integrity, rather than a reactionary response to pressure or fear. Emotional preparation is also key. The protagonist must be ready to face the sister's potential anger, disappointment, or manipulative tactics without succumbing to them. This requires mental resilience, self-assurance, and the ability to maintain composure under emotional stress. By preparing emotionally, the protagonist strengthens their ability to uphold self-respect, even when confronted with conflict. Standing firm in self-respect also has a ripple effect on relationships. While some family members may initially react negatively, over time, respect can grow when it is recognized that the protagonist is acting from principle rather than weakness or fear. It can also set a precedent for healthier family interactions. In the future, where boundaries are acknowledged and emotional manipulation is less likely to be effective. Moreover, standing firm can serve as a model of integrity for others. The protagonist's decision demonstrates that it is possible to navigate complex moral and emotional situations without compromising one's values. This can encourage others to reflect on their own boundaries, develop self-respect, and approach conflicts with honesty and courage. Another dimension of this keynote is the distinction between compassion and compliance. Standing firm does not necessarily mean rejecting the sister or withdrawing love. The protagonist can still express care and empathy while declining to take on the role. This highlights that self-respect does not preclude kindness or consideration. Rather, it ensures that kindness is not coerced or forced at the expense of personal integrity. It is also important to recognize that the cost of standing firm may be emotional or relational, but the cost of giving in can be even greater in the long term. Compromising values can lead to guilt, regret, resentment, and diminished self-worth. By choosing self-respect, the protagonist preserves their sense of identity and ensures that future actions remain authentic and aligned with their conscience. The decision to stand firm is ultimately about ownership of one's life. It is about acknowledging that while we cannot control the actions of others, we can control how we respond to them. By refusing to yield to threats or manipulation, the protagonist asserts agency over their own life and choices. This empowerment is essential for emotional stability, personal growth, and long-term well-being. In addition, standing firm requires balancing emotional empathy with moral clarity. The protagonist can empathize with the sister's feelings, recognize her vulnerabilities, and understand her perspective, while still maintaining their decision. Empathy does not mean submission. It means understanding without compromising one's own values. This distinction is crucial for maintaining healthy relationships without sacrificing self-respect. The story also illustrates that self-respect is not static, it is an ongoing practice. Standing firm in one situation reinforces the ability to do so in future conflicts. Each experience of maintaining boundaries and acting in accordance with personal values strengthens confidence, emotional resilience, and moral clarity. In conclusion, this keynote highlights that standing firm in self-respect is a profound act of courage and integrity. It involves recognizing the value of one's own principles, maintaining personal boundaries, resisting coercion, and making decisions that align with one's conscience. It requires emotional resilience, moral clarity, and the willingness to face potential relational consequences. By choosing self-respect, the protagonist not only protects their emotional well-being, but also sets a standard for healthy family dynamics, demonstrating that true love and connection are built on mutual respect rather than fear, guilt, or manipulation. Ultimately, this story shows that sometimes choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary for living a life of integrity, emotional balance, and authentic selfhood. Consequences, healing, and resolution are essential parts of any story that involves deep emotional conflict, especially when family, personal values, and moral decisions are intertwined. In the situation faced by the protagonist, the decision about whether to accept the role of godmother carries weight far beyond the immediate moment. It has long-term, emotional, relational, and psychological consequences. Every choice made in such a scenario produces results that shape the individual's inner life and their relationships with others. If the protagonist decides to refuse the request, the immediate consequence may be a sense of loss. The sister may react with anger, disappointment, or even threats of estrangement, creating tension and emotional distance in the family. The fear of losing familial connections can feel devastating because family often represents security, identity, and belonging. These feelings of potential loss can be very painful, and the protagonist may experience sadness, guilt, or anxiety as they navigate the aftermath. Despite these challenges, refusing the role can also bring significant positive consequences, particularly in terms of inner peace and clarity. By acting in alignment with personal values and moral beliefs, the protagonist preserves their sense of integrity and self-respect. This alignment between values and action produces a form of emotional clarity that is essential for long-term well-being. Even though the choice may create temporary discomfort or conflict, It provides a foundation for emotional resilience, self-confidence, and authentic living. On the other hand, if the protagonist decides to accept the role despite internal discomfort, they may maintain family connections and avoid immediate conflict. The sister may feel reassured, and family relationships may appear preserved. However, the cost of this choice can be internal. Accepting a role that conflicts with personal values may lead to ongoing feelings of unease, resentment, or moral compromise. Over time, the tension between outward compliance and inner dissonance can create stress, emotional exhaustion, or a sense of lost authenticity. The internal struggle may linger, sometimes subtly affecting other areas of life, including emotional health, decision-making, and personal relationships. This duality highlights the complex nature of consequences. There is rarely a choice that is entirely free of difficulty. Every decision carries trade-offs between external outcomes and internal states. The protagonist's journey illustrates that consequences are not only about what happens in the outside world, but also about how one feels and grows in response to the decision. Healing is a critical part of this process. Emotional healing occurs when the protagonist reflects on their choices, processes the feelings that arise, and comes to terms with the outcomes. Healing is not simply about eliminating pain, but about understanding it, integrating it into one's life, and finding ways to move forward with emotional balance. For example, if the protagonist refuses the role, they may initially feel guilt or sadness over the potential loss of connection. Through reflection and time, they can process these feelings, recognize that they acted with integrity, and understand that preserving self-respect is essential for long-term emotional health. Similarly, if they accept the role and struggle internally, healing may involve learning to manage internal conflict, setting boundaries within the role, and finding ways to maintain authenticity while engaging in family life. Growth naturally follows from both scenarios. Growth occurs as the protagonist learns more about themselves, their values, and their capacity to navigate complex emotional and moral situations. They gain insight into how to handle family pressure, how to balance empathy with personal boundaries, and how to act with courage under duress. These lessons strengthen emotional resilience, decision-making skills, and moral clarity. The process of rebuilding relationships is also closely tied to healing and growth. Family conflicts often leave temporary wounds that can improve over time if approached thoughtfully. If the protagonist maintains firm but respectful boundaries, the sister may eventually understand the perspective and appreciate the protagonist's honesty, even if initially it caused conflict. Over time, relationships can evolve into healthier forms, where respect, understanding, and empathy replace manipulation, guilt, or fear. In cases where the protagonist accepts the role, rebuilding may involve addressing internal conflict and establishing new ways of engaging with family dynamics. Clear communication, setting boundaries, and negotiating responsibilities can help restore balance and reduce tension, allowing relationships to thrive without compromising personal integrity. This keynote also emphasizes that resolution is not always immediate. Emotional and relational healing often requires patience, time, and ongoing effort. Conflict resolution involves not only the practical restoration of relationships, but also the psychological reconciliation of feelings such as guilt, anger, fear, or hurt. The protagonist may find that the process of reconciliation is gradual, requiring self-reflection, conversations, and consistent emotional care for themselves and for others. Another important aspect of resolution is understanding that personal boundaries are critical for maintaining healthy relationships. Whether the protagonist accepts or refuses the role, clearly defining what is acceptable and what is not helps prevent future conflicts and provides a framework for healthier interactions. Boundaries ensure that relationships are based on mutual respect rather than coercion or emotional manipulation, fostering long-term emotional stability for all involved. The story also teaches that consequences can serve as a catalyst for positive change. Difficult decisions, even when painful, often lead to personal growth, stronger emotional intelligence, and more thoughtful ways of interacting with others. By facing challenges head-on and responding with integrity, the protagonist gains experience and insight that enhances future decision-making and resilience. Compassion remains central to this process, whether the protagonist refuses or accepts. Empathy toward the child, the sister, and other family members can guide actions in a constructive manner. Recognizing the innocence of the child, understanding the sister's vulnerabilities, and balancing these considerations with personal values allows for a resolution that is both principled and humane. This approach encourages relationships to heal without forcing compromise on essential beliefs. Ultimately, the journey of consequences, healing, and resolution highlights the interconnectedness of personal integrity, emotional well-being, and relational health. The protagonist learns that every choice carries consequences, but that facing those consequences consciously and with moral courage is the path to true resolution. Healing comes through reflection, acceptance, and time, while growth emerges from the lessons learned and the strengthening of personal boundaries. Relationships can be rebuilt with healthier dynamics, mutual respect, and understanding, creating an environment where love and connection are grounded in honesty and integrity rather than fear, guilt, or coercion. In conclusion, this keynote shows that difficult decisions in complex family situations inevitably produce consequences. But these consequences do not have to be destructive. Through reflection, emotional processing, and thoughtful action, the protagonist can achieve healing, personal growth, and resolution. Whether choosing self-respect over immediate compliance, or navigating internal conflict while maintaining family ties, the journey emphasizes that integrity, empathy, and boundary setting are crucial for long-term emotional health and the possibility of rebuilding relationships in a more authentic and balanced way. This story demonstrates that while the consequences of difficult choices may be challenging, they also offer opportunities for learning, growth, and ultimately, meaningful resolution that honors both personal values and relational bonds.